My Country 'Tis of Thee, how one song reveals the history of civil rights, by Claire Rudolph Murphy, illustrated by Brian Coyler. More than any other, one song traces America's history of patriotism and protest. Since 1831, Americans have sung My Country 'Tis of Thee to honor the freedoms promised in the Declaration of Independence. Protesters for equal rights have claimed their place in this nation's history by writing and singing new verses. The song first appeared in England in the 1740s as God Save the King. Supporters of King George II sang it during a 1745 power struggle for the British throne. After Bonnie Prince Charlie, King George's rival, defeated English soldiers in Scotland, his followers sang a new verse to honor their hero's right to be king. Across the Atlantic, English colonists sang God Save the King at public gatherings. British colonial soldiers sang the song to celebrate their victories in the French and Indian War. A charismatic preacher named George Whitefield popularized new verses set to the melody. He preached that all men are equal and should praise God together, rich and poor, white and black, including slaves. Talk of liberty spread across the new land. But colonists had no voice in Parliament. In 1765, King George III began taxing the colonists without their consent. Frustrated, they refused to buy goods from England and drank coffee or Dutch tea instead of English tea. Women wove their own fabric instead of using English linen, while men held secret meetings and dumped English tea in the harbor. Loyal colonists continued to sing the British verses, but angry citizens called for a revolution. On July 4th, 1776, Americans declared themselves independent of England. Early in the war, British soldiers and loyalists sang God Save the King after every victory. Revolutionary soldiers shouted their own new verses as they marched into battle. They dreamed of freedom and having a voice in their new country's government. 7 years later, the colonists finally won their independence. A new country was formed, the United States of America. Its leaders wrote a constitution that promised justice and liberty for all. White male landowners elected the first president. Songwriters wrote dozens of new verses to celebrate the new country and the new president. In 1789, Americans serenaded President George Washington in New York City on his inauguration day. But it was not an auspicious day for everyone. For years, women like Abigail Adams had encouraged leaders to remember the ladies when they wrote our country's new laws. But the men did not listen. In most states, women were not free to vote, to own property, or to make important decisions about their children's lives. In 1795, an anonymous woman published this protest verse in a Philadelphia newspaper. Many still did not believe that women deserved the same freedoms as men. Americans celebrated their new country every year on the 4th of July. But they had no national anthem to sing. In 1831, a seminary student named Samuel Francis Smith wrote patriotic verses to a melody he found in an old German hymnal. He had no idea his new song shared the same tune as God Save the King. At the Independence Day service, the children's choir at Park Street Church in Boston debuted the song Smith called America. but black children could only listen from the back of the church. America was not a land of the noble free for the 4 million slaves in the South. Calling for an end to slavery, abolitionists wrote hundreds of protest verses to well-known tunes. They were sung at rallies and meetings across the land. But slavery did not end. In 1861, the Civil War broke out between the North and the South over slavery and states' rights. Northern soldiers sang America as they marched into battle. Southern soldiers sang different verses, such as God Save the South. Civilians on both sides performed old and new verses at public parades and around the piano at home. Thousands of Yankee and rebel soldiers died as the war dragged on. When President Abraham Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the Confederate States, he and Mrs. Lincoln sang America with soldiers and freed slaves at Union battle camps. And when the war finally ended in 1865, free black people sang new verses at joyous celebrations. In 1870, freedom's sons of color gained a voice through voting, too. In the decades following the Civil War, protesters supporting many causes wrote new lyrics to the country's favorite melody. Labor activists believed that equal rights meant better working conditions, higher pay, an 8-hour workday, and an end to child labor. Their protest helped pass laws that improved working conditions. By 1900, Americans were expected to know America by heart. The easy-to-sing melody and patriotic verses were taught to new immigrants to promote America's values. Every morning, school children would sing it and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Poets such as Henry Van Dyke were inspired to write new patriotic verses. But America was not chosen as the national anthem. The tune to God Save Our King would not do. In 1868, men of color were allowed to vote, but not freedom's daughters, black or white. Women sang new verses demanding their right to the ballot box, and they kept on singing and marching until all women won the right to vote in 1920. But the privilege to vote didn't extend to Native Americans, male or female. Even though American Indians had lived on this land for thousands of years, they still were not considered citizens of the United States. In 1919, Sioux writer Sitkala Sa protested by publishing her poem, A Red Man's America. Equality did not exist for everyone in America. People of color were not treated as full citizens. They couldn't attend the same schools, eat at the same restaurants, or shop at the same stores as white Americans. In 1939, opera star Marian Anderson wasn't allowed to sing inside Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., so she sang on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in front of 75,000 people. In protest and in patriotism, she performed America's favorite song but changed 2 words. She sang for all her country's people in hopes that her nation would become a place of liberty for all. Millions of Americans, including 10-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., listened on the radio. In 1944, 15-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. won a contest with his speech, "The Negro and the Constitution." It featured the story of Anderson's inspiring concert, "Black America Still Wears Chains." Miss Anderson may not as yet spend the night in any good hotel in America. 19 years later, during the March on Washington, King himself stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial. "I have a dream," his voice rang out. "From every mountainside, let freedom ring." 45 years later, the first person of color was elected to the highest office in the land. At President Barack Obama's inauguration, legendary singer Aretha Franklin performed. The crowd, stretching from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, cheered as she sang about America's journey toward liberty for all. Now, it's your turn. Write a new verse for a cause you believe in. Help freedom ring.
My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land,